I'm Josh Hammer, and this is The Josh Hammer Show. Last June, during the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, there was an ongoing debate as to whether or not Donald Trump would intervene on behalf of the United States. It was a tortured debate. It was a debate that was consuming headlines day in and day out for a very chaotic, nearly 2-week stretch. Yet again, now we find ourselves here in January of the new year dealing with a very similar situation. Will he or won't he? Will Donald Trump intervene? Will he address the fact that his own stipulated red line has been flagrantly crossed, or will he not? The stakes are high. In 2012, as the Syrian civil war was just getting underway, Barack Obama announced that if chemical weapons were to be utilized in the context of the war, namely by the former despot there, the Russia and Iran-backed Alawites Bashar al-Assad, Barack Obama said that that would be a red line for us, meaning the United States. That was in August 2012. About 1 year later, in August 2013, that red line was flagrantly crossed. Sarin gas was used by Bashar al-Assad to kill at least hundreds, possibly thousands, of innocent Syrians. Frankly, that is just a rounding error in the total number of Syrians who were killed, roughly 500,000 or so. That number at the time, though, of the sarin gas attack included women, children, horrific. In response, the Obama administration initially uttered some tough words. Subsequently, though, they changed their tune. They deployed people like John Kerry at the State Department and Chuck Hagel at the Pentagon. They deployed them to Congress to testify and to assure senators that action was coming, but it would be a very narrow, targeted, pinprick strike. And then, sure enough, Obama negotiated a diplomatic off-ramp with Vladimir Putin in Russia, whereby Russia, which was a leading patron of Syria at the time, would allegedly find a way to get the chemical weapons inside Syria and to collect them, ultimately then hand them off to the proverbial international community for subsequent destruction. It was an embarrassing failure to enforce a red line. It was a moment from which Barack Obama's presidency never recovered. Is Donald Trump going to do the same thing? We're not big fans of red lines here on this show. We discussed this earlier this week. I prefer my foreign policy to be that of Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist number 70. In the Federalist 70, one of the great Federalist papers drafted by Alexander Hamilton, arguing on behalf of the unitary executive structure, that is to say, the singular president embodied in Article 2 of the Constitution, Hamilton famously argues that unity in the executive is important because decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch will generally characterize the proceedings of one man in a much more eminent degree than the proceedings of any greater number. Like Hamilton, I believe in secrecy in the executive. Like Teddy Roosevelt, many years later, I believe in the maxim of speaking softly and carrying a big stick. But that is not relevant to what we now face. Donald Trump has issued, for weeks now, a recurring red line when it comes to whether or not the Iranian regime is going to massacre their own civilians. On January 2nd, so 2 weeks ago now, Donald Trump wrote on Truth Social, if Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, the United States of America will come to the rescue. We are locked and loaded and ready to go. Around that time, on January 2nd, roughly 500 to 600 Iranians were estimated to have been killed in the then nascent uprising, which had started the week prior, just before the new year. That number today has skyrocketed from 500 to 600 to now an estimated, very hard to tell, it's essentially impossible to say, there's no reliable numbers here, but we think somewhere between 12 and 20,000, if not more than that. What's more, earlier this week, Trump doubled down on Truth Social. He said, Iranian patriots, keep protesting. Take over your institutions. Save the names of the killers and abusers. They will pay a big price. Stop. Help is on the way. It is impossible to avoid the obvious implications of these statements. Trump said that if the Islamist regime in Tehran continues the slaughter of its own citizens, then the United States will indeed take some unspecified, but nonetheless clearly major action to staunch the bleeding. That seems to have changed just over the past 36 hours, give or take. Beginning on Wednesday, you had some reports that some of the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, perhaps Egypt as well, allegedly tried to persuade Donald Trump that there would be serious consequences to the U.S. taking action. It was around the same time that the U.S. was already preemptively removing military personnel from the largest U.S. military base in the region, Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, as well as other assets in places like Iraq, Syria, and so forth. But the fear of repercussions from the Iranian regime did not stop Donald Trump from sending the B-2 bombers last June, did it? So that doesn't quite add up either. Even more peculiar, there was a report from the New York Times yesterday on Thursday showing that Benjamin Netanyahu allegedly, if you believe the reporting, allegedly asked Donald Trump to postpone any planned attack on Iran, which is wholly illogical taken at face value. The Iran threat has taken up large swaths of Netanyahu's career. He and Trump seem to be entirely simpatico on the same page. Let's not forget that in 2024, around the time that he was being reelected to a second term, the DOJ actually formally indicted numerous individuals, charging them with planned assassinations of Donald Trump on behalf of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the militant wing of the Islamist clerisy, the theocracy there in Iran. So what in the world is actually going on here? Now, my best guess continues to be that we are looking at some very high-profile kayfabe, which is a fancy way of saying WWE-style wrestling. If I were placing my bets, I still think that there is going to be some sort of action beyond the increased tariffs, beyond the increased sanctions that we've seen over the past 2 days from the United States. The alternative is that perhaps the New York Times has it right. Perhaps there is a chance that Netanyahu does not want Trump to take action, in which case we could conclude one of two things. On the one hand, perhaps Israel genuinely does fear reprisal from Iran. Maybe they genuinely do not have the missile defense in place. I find that very difficult to believe. The alternative is that perhaps the Israelis got word, or they at least suspected, that if Trump were to do anything, that it would be a Kerry, Hagel, Obama-style pinprick strike. It's very difficult to know what to make of this. Again, the notion that Trump could do a pinprick strike now flies in the face of the spectacular B-2 bombing runs that we saw over 4 down Natanz and the other facilities in Iran last June. But make no mistake about it, a red line has been breached, has been violated, has been trampled over. I would not have advised that red line be made, but now that it has been made, it has been crossed repeatedly. It's actually even worse than that. Just earlier today, one of the leading advisors to the Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran apparently said in an address that the Iranian people heard, that he was recommending to the mullahs and to Khamenei himself that they start executing more of the protesters. So when Donald Trump said a couple days ago that the killing has stopped and there are no more executions, it's far from obvious that continues, that looks like it will be the case moving forward. For what it's worth, Mike Waltz, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, was doubling down on all options still being on the table just on Thursday. Go ahead and watch this from Mike Waltz, the current U.S. ambassador to the United Nations.
Let me be clear. President Trump is a man of action, not endless talk like we see at the United Nations. He has made it clear all options are on the table to stop the slaughter. And no one should know that better than the leadership of the Iranian regime.
So he's reiterating that all options are on the table while the president is giving off the impression that the calculus has changed. So what is actually going to happen? Look, at the end of the day, Israel's an important ally for sure. I've argued this at great length. I even wrote a book largely on these themes. But Donald Trump needs to do, at this point, what is best for Donald Trump, the United States. Whether this is very high profile, try to throw off the enemy, head fake, kayfabe between Trump and Netanyahu, which I think it probably is, But in the alternative, if there actually is a combination of pushback, both within the Trump administration from the more isolationist actors within the administration on the one hand, combined with potentially not just Arab allies in the Middle East, but also Israel. So on the one hand, this could be high-profile kayfabe, this head fake. On the other hand, there could be real pushback. The relevant point is this, that it is Donald Trump's reputation now that is on the line. It is his reputation that he has to uphold. He chose to make those posts. He chose to issue those threats, those very clear statements on his own social media site, Truth Social. He didn't have to do that, but he chose to do it. Perhaps it was advisable, perhaps it was inadvisable. It does not matter at this point. You cannot let this regime get away with trampling on your red line. Trump didn't allow them to do it last June. He didn't allow Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela to escape after making lots of threats against him. He didn't allow the various Islamist factions in Nigeria to escape after making lots of threats to them to stop slaughtering Christians. They learned that the hard way on Christmas Day, symbolically of all days. And now it is incumbent upon the president to make sure that the mullahs do not escape neatly this time. Trump faces a fork in the road. On the one hand, he could go down, God forbid, the path of Barack Obama as a president who let his foreign policy dwindle by not enforcing a clear red line. On the other hand, Donald Trump has a unique opportunity to be even more of a man of history, a great man of history, that is, than he already is. I hope he does the right thing. For what it's worth, I think he will. Stay with us through the break. I'm Josh Hammer. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Well, there's all this talk, of course, about the U.S. potentially taking military action in Iran, but most of the conversation otherwise continues to focus on immigration, ICE, and what the heck is happening in Minneapolis. Again, I don't pretend to know what exactly is happening there in the Twin Cities. Maybe there's something in the tap water. Why in the world is Minneapolis this frigid, cold city with this long-standing Democrat farmer Labor Party tradition? I mean, why are they at the epicenter of all this? Really? I mean, George Floyd in 2020 to the Somali fraud scandal that continues to be just an exploding national story. I'm hoping to see many more indictments, prosecutions in that story for what it's worth. And now to the Renee Good shooting from Jonathan Ross, the ICE agent, and the protests that are now threatening to spread over the country. I don't know what the heck is going on in Minnesota, but I know that it is not good. And among the things that are not good is the addle-brained governor, Tim Walz, who really ought to resign in disgrace if he had any modicum of shame or self-awareness about him whatsoever. Tim Walz is an utter and complete disgrace to his job, to his position, to his state, to his people, to his countrymen. He is an appalling, absolute disgrace. A couple nights ago, he took to YouTube to call on Minnesotans, his own citizens, to take their cameras and be citizen activists and start to film the ICE agents, film their atrocities, he said, for purposes of future lawsuits. By who? By the ACLU? What are you doing, dude? What is your goal here? Is your goal actually, as we speculate on this show, is your actual goal not just to endanger, but God forbid, to get more ICE agents actually killed? For what it's worth, reporting at the Washington Free Beacon indicates that the ragtag rogue Marxist organization known as ICE Watch, which is the organization that Renee Good belonged to, that she was quote-unquote trained by before she had her fatal confrontation with Jonathan Ross, the ICE agent. This is an organization that tries to train leftist citizen activists to stop ICE immigration enforcement in order to engage in de-arresting operations, which is a very fancy way of saying that you try then to go to the federal agents while he is arresting an illegal alien and stop the arrest. You know, a better word for de-arrest is anarchy, or maybe insurrection as well. You know, as the case may be, Stephen Miller, the top domestic policy deputy chief of staff at the White House, Stephen Miller has some thoughts on anarchy and insurrection in Minnesota. Go ahead and watch this from Stephen Miller.
But, well, I guess I'll just go back full circle and say that in Minnesota right now, the The insurrectionists have come out of hiding. They're confronting our officers on the street. They're being arrested. This is a national security priority. More arrests of insurrectionists are being made every day, and each of those arrests then provides an opportunity to learn more about the network from a law enforcement and national security standpoint.
So he's calling this an insurrection because it looks a lot like an insurrection. Again, ICE Watch, this organization that is apparently behind a lot of these protests. By the way, there was a big follow the money style report that showed that this big climate change boondoggle is actually behind and potentially paying many of these protesters as well. That climate change organization has gotten funding from all the usual suspects, whether it's the Tides Foundation, George Soros' Open Society Foundation, all the usual left-wing suspects are in on the action here in Minnesota. So ICE Watch, that other far-left group that Renee Good, the now deceased leftist activist who was killed by Jonathan Ross, the ICE agent, in an act of self-defense, ICE Watch, the group that she belonged to, has now come out with a new statement to Stephen Miller's point. ICE Watch now saying that, quote, the time is ripe to embrace militancy. Militancy. And they're saying that you have to escalate your demands against ICE officers by any means necessary. That is code word for violence is appropriate. Force is appropriate. By any means necessary is the exact same language you hear from the keffiyeh-clad Hamas freaks, the from the river to the sea people. When they support Hamas, when they support jihad, when they support murder, rape, pillaging, violence, they say by any means necessary. That's what ICE Watch is saying here in a domestic context about ICE agents in Minneapolis. By the way, just corroborating this. So ICE Watch saying there is nothing left to do but escalate. Disgusting. And Tim Walz, the governor, totally corroborating this by saying hours after this ICE Watch statement was put out, Tim Walz saying that he also encouraged residents to resist ICE, and he accused ICE of carrying out, quote, a campaign of organized brutality. Organized brutality. Just unbelievable stuff. I absolutely unbelievable. You know, once upon a time, the Democrats were not totally crazy on the issue of immigration. Earlier this week, we were discussing this portion of Bill Clinton's 1995 State of the Union address, talking about the threat of legal immigration. Turns out it actually was not just Bill Clinton. It actually even included people like Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama. Go ahead and watch this montage compiled by Fox Business.
And as long as the current laws are on the books, it's not just hardened felons who are subject to removal, but sometimes families who are just trying to earn a living. And sometimes when I talk to immigration advocates, you know, they wish I could just bypass Congress and change the law myself. But that's not how democracy works. To the undocumented workers, you have to say, look, you've broken the law. You didn't come here the way you were supposed to. So this is not going to be a free ride.
We must continue to do everything we can to strengthen our borders, enforce our laws, and remove illegal aliens from our country. Whether they're innocent or guilty of the crimes they're charged with in court, they're still here illegally, and they should be sent out of the country.
Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple. People who enter the United States without our permission are illegal aliens.
Democrats support also enforcing laws, current laws, against those who came here illegally.
Could you imagine any of that happening today? Like literally any of that? Chuck freaking Schumer saying that Democrats support enforcing immigration law against illegals, undocumented, whatever Orwellian term you want to use. Could you imagine them saying that today? Unbelievable. Just absolutely unbelievable. Look, right now you have one of the two major political parties in America that cannot squarely answer the question, as Jacob Fry, the mayor of Minneapolis, deeply struggled to do earlier this week in a Fox News interview with Griff Jenkins. You have a lot of Democrats who are struggling mightily to answer the very basic question as to whether or not ICE should be abolished. And in that context, ICE is not just an agency. It is a proxy for immigration law. You see, this is the globalist dream. They don't believe in borders. They don't believe in such thing as immigration law. If you actually take the John Lennon imagine, the globalism utopia, no nations, no religion, no borders, no war, you take that to its logical conclusion, they don't believe in immigration law. And that is why Stephen Miller is fundamentally correct that this is an insurrection. It is an insurrection, it is domestic anarchy. Very similar, as we've been arguing for weeks now, to the neo-Confederate insurrection and anarchy that Abraham Lincoln put down. Abraham Lincoln, by the way, knew a thing or two about the Insurrection Act of 1807. In fact, Abraham Lincoln actually invoked the Insurrection Act on April 15th, 1861, just days after the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter. The Insurrection Act, which Donald Trump is now threatening to invoke, has been invoked all throughout American history, beginning with Jefferson in 1808, most recently with President George H.W. Bush in 1992 in the context of the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. It's a statute that allows the domestic use of the military to restore order amidst insurrection and anarchy. Well, if so-called sanctuary cities really are the bastions of neo-Confederate sentiment that I believe that they are, if they really believe that the federal government is immoral and evil and the states have an obligation to defy, to nullify federal law, then wouldn't it stand to reason that the remedy is the same remedy that Lincoln invoked? That's the Insurrection Act of 1807. For days, President Trump's been threatening to invoke this statute. I'm not sure, Mr. President, what you're waiting for. You should act on this. Law and order must be restored. And yes, as they say, by any means necessary. Stay with us through the break. I'm Josh Hammer. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Jordan Peterson, one of the most famous persons in the entire, not just right-of-center speaking and commenting space, really at this point, one of the most well-known academics, just individuals, really, in North America. Jordan Peterson became famous, among other things, for saying over and over again, to make your bed in the morning. He was really reaching out, above all, to disaffected young men. He was saying, his message was, that if you begin your day by, among other things, making your bed, by taking care of the small things, you are setting yourself up for success and a good day. That order and structure are important, and that order and structure begin with the small things. Think of it as Rudy Giuliani-style broken windows policing, and then turn that into day-to-day living and ethics. So broken windows policing is the theory that if you begin enforcing crimes against broken windows, petty crime, petty larceny, things like that, then that will then send a message that the bigger crimes, the rape, the homicide, grand theft auto, etc., then that will definitely be enforced. And it was remarkably successful, for whatever it's worth, as a matter of urban policing, from the Giuliani administration through the Bloomberg administration before Bill de Blasio threw it out the window. Well, so too is Jordan Peterson's style, make your bed, a very successful basic guideline for how to live your life. This is one of the big divides as well between Charlie Kirk and his lifelong archfoe, an archfoe who, nonetheless, people like Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly continue to laud and promote, that being Nick Fuentes. Charlie Kirk, may his memory be a blessing, very much took the Jordan Peterson approach. If you look at the massive archive of Charlie's talks and lectures and his back and forth with questioners at his myriad events, all of that digital archive on YouTube or elsewhere, you will see him repeatedly say to young men, teenagers, 20-somethings, his core audience for his tragically truncated life, he said over and over again, take your life into your own hands. If you look in the mirror and you don't like the way you look, go to the gym. Start working out. If you're tired of eating dinner by yourself in your one-bedroom apartment, you're tired of going to sleep by yourself at night, you're lonely, find that girl and ask her out on a date. Maybe you'll even ask her hand in marriage. God willing, you'll have children. You don't like your current job, your occupation? Work harder. Develop a new skill set. maybe go back to school, learn a new technical trade, whatever the case may be, you control, because we are human beings. We have free will and we have human agency. It's a core Peterson-Kirk concept. On the other hand, you have the Nick Fuentes-style victimology. A victimology that is shared by both the Fuentes quote-unquote right, to the extent that it's on the right, which it really isn't. And that victimology, that victim mentality is shared by the left. In kind of a bizarre horseshoe effect, you have this victimology between parts of the so-called right and the large bulk of the left, best embodied and encapsulated by the DEI mentality. The entire premise of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is a victim mentality. If you are a black person, a Hispanic person, if you are a sexual minority, whatever the case may be, then you're oppressed. And it's not your fault, you see, the DEI people say, because you were born into that repression. Your white Christian and also Asian and Jewish overlords, they have systemically been oppressing you since before you were born. You didn't even know it. This is basically Nick Fuentes' message as well, when he calls for people to so aggressively rage against the machine, as he does. He doesn't believe in human agency. He believes that his followers, that the Groypers, are victims. Well, ironically, I didn't necessarily see this coming, but Oprah Winfrey, of all people, had some very interesting and, I would argue, troubling comments. When it comes to weight loss, Oprah is one of the largest stakeholders of Weight Watchers. She very famously has been back and forth when it comes to her own weight over the years. She's spoken about this at great length. And she had comments on this that really brought me back to this whole broader debate between agency versus victimology. Go ahead and watch Oprah Winfrey talking on The View.
Yes, you know why it's one of my biggest regrets? Because I think that moment contributed to the diet culture in a way to say, look at what I've done, now you can do it. And even though everybody said to me, oh, you're going to put it back on, because I thought it was my fault, and because I always thought, like so many of you in the world are thinking it's about willpower. It is not. Because I thought it was about willpower, I thought that moment, oh, it's gone. I thought that moment had proven that I have the willpower, because I went 4 months and I didn't eat a morsel of food.
Okay, so Oprah Winfrey essentially saying that sheer willpower is not enough. That willpower is not enough in order to lose weight, but you actually really ought to get on medication as well. Now, most people, I think, hear that and they say, well, that's a little weird. But then you think about it a little more, and perhaps it's actually even more than weird. You would not be wrong to ask about whether there are some ulterior motives going on here. In fact, I was looking around, and Jillian Michaels, actually, the well-known fitness guru, was actually on Jillian's own show just a couple weeks ago to discuss the Maduro operation in Venezuela. So about 2 years ago, Jillian Michaels actually claimed that Oprah Winfrey has a, quote, financial incentive with Ozempic, after Oprah admitted to using various weight loss medication and losing 40 pounds. And apparently, according to Jillian Michaels, Oprah has this financial incentive to Ozempic, and maybe perhaps to Big Pharma more generally, through her stake at Weight Watchers. Weight Watchers is now in the Ozempic business, if you have not been paying attention to their particular business model. Your mileage may vary as to what to make of that. For what it's worth, shortly after Jillian Michaels made these comments in January 2024, Oprah Winfrey actually resigned from the board of Weight Watchers, but to my knowledge, she has not financially divested, so the financial complications may well still be there. But even more troubling than whatever ulterior motive there may or may not be when it comes to Oprah Winfrey talking about how willpower is not enough, even more troubling, indeed profoundly more troubling than that, is the actual message itself. Oprah is someone who has led a very inspiring story, coming up from the poor background she did and now being a billionaire, one of the wealthiest black people in America and, frankly, the world. She is looked up to as a hero by countless Americans, mostly on the left, because she's very publicly of the left, speaking as she did at the Democratic National Committee in Chicago in August 2024, but still, she is still lionized by many of both a political and an apolitical variety. So it should really disturb us that Oprah Winfrey is questioning and calling into deep question, really undermining the entire notion that human beings can take their own lives into their hands. I could not disagree with this more. I have countless friends. I've never been obese. My weight's fluctuated a little bit like any adult, but I have numerous friends who were actually obese. I mean, I'm talking like 300 plus weight pounds, who lost a ton of weight. I have one friend who lost like 180 pounds by doing nothing more than walking an insane amount over the course of the day and giving up alcohol. That's it. I have another friend who lost a similar amount, easily over 100 pounds. I'm not sure if 180, but 120, 130, whatever. Same thing. Just walks around all day in New York City, eats a little healthier, and gave up the booze. Oprah, why is that not good enough? Shouldn't we be encouraging young people to do it au natural, to do it the natural way? This definitely is the Charlie Kirk, Jordan Peterson mentality. Call it the Josh Hammer mentality too. If you have a chronic medical condition, by all means, take some medication. I take some prescription drugs as well for various conditions. Nothing severe, but a couple of smaller things. But this is not that. This is weight loss. If you are so undisciplined that you can't get yourself to eat better, go to the gym, do basic things to lose weight, then you're never going to have the discipline that's necessary for life itself. And that is the real problem with Oprah's terrible comments. Frankly, she should be ashamed of herself. Awful, awful stuff from Oprah Winfrey. I'm Josh Hammer. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this break. I'm Josh Hammer, and welcome back. Before the break, we were speaking about Oprah Winfrey and human agency. Does she believe in it, or does she not believe in it? Frankly, you might be confused based on her astounding recent comments about human willpower, Ozempic, and weight loss. I think now about the foreign stage. There is one particular population across the world who Western powers, for decades, have said don't really have human agency to overcome their own circumstances. Think for a second about what that could be. I'll give you a second, really. You got it? Okay, yeah, it's the Palestinian Arabs. How many times over the past 50, 60, 70 years have we heard Western lawmakers, from Brussels to Turtle Bay, the United Nations, to everywhere, all the corridors of power, the UN, the Democratic National Committee, the Barack Obama administration, they always say the Palestinians are victims of their own circumstances. You can't expect them to stop subsidizing jihad, the pay-for-slay scheme. How can you convince them, or how can you expect them to do that? They're the victims of their own circumstances, don't you see? Palestinianism as an identity is this DEI Fuente-style victimology transported to the world stage. The Palestinians, the so-called Palestinians, are now back in the news yet again this week. Steve Witkoff, who is the U.S. Special Envoy, not just for the Middle East, but for Russia-Ukraine, he's kind of just Donald Trump's right-hand man when it comes to international diplomacy, for better or for worse, as the case may be. So on Wednesday, earlier this week, Steve Witkoff announcing the launch of what is known as Phase 2 of Donald Trump's 20-point plan for finally winding down the war in Gaza. And the big news specifically this week is that Phase 2 commences with the establishment of a new quasi-government of sorts in the Gaza Strip. It is a technocratic Palestinian administration. It's known as the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. Allegedly, these folks who are ruling this, some folks from the PA, the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas's group, not particularly moderate, to be honest with you, but allegedly, the individuals in charge have been vetted by the United States and by Israel. I keep on saying allegedly and hedging my language because I'm frankly not entirely sure how much vetting was done here. So the leader of this committee, of this new technocratic interim Phase 2 committee to try to rule Gaza outside of Hamas, The leader is the former deputy transportation minister of the Palestinian Authority, a man by the name of Dr. Ali Shaath. He doesn't necessarily seem to be a moderate figure. So, for instance, when it comes to Palestinian Arab sovereignty over broader parts of the broader land of Israel, the Holy Land, he said at one point, quote, "We need a new vision as Palestinian people to transfer the destruction of the war to a resilient environment that will lead to liberty from the Israeli occupation and to Palestinian sovereignty on Palestinian lands in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Jerusalem." Jerusalem. So he wants to conquer Jerusalem. Great. So this is the so-called moderate, now in charge of this technocratic government in stage 2. Crazy. How about on the use of jihad? So the same guy who's the head of the technocracy, now kind of sort of maybe ruling Gaza, Dr. Ali Shaath, when it comes to jihad, says, quote, "International law gives the right to any people that live under the occupation to resist that occupation." Here we go again, folks. Earlier, in the context of ICE, I was talking about by any means necessary. That's this. By any means necessary. That's what he's saying there. Some moderate. Look, we'll see where it goes. Obviously, everyone wants the bloodshed to wind down. The fundamental problem with this whole ritualistic song and dance, this 20-point plan, all of this, I wish nothing but the best. The fundamental problem is that you are dealing with profoundly ideological actors. These are not rational, calculating figures. They're not the Cold War era atheist Soviets whose moves you can basically map out using game theory or war game exercises. You can't predict this because they are ideologues. Hamas exists to subjugate all infidels, whom they define as Jews, Christians, and non-Sharia supremacist Muslims. Good luck in terms of trying to get them to bow out of power. By the way, even at this point, the stipulated terms for so-called Phase 2 have not actually really been met yet, have they? Specifically, the final body of a slain Israeli has not actually been returned from the Gaza Strip. This is a master sergeant who was killed on October 7th by the name of Ron Gavili. So the latest is that U.S. intelligence believes that it's not Hamas, but Palestinian Islamic Jihad that is currently holding his body. Witkoff saying basically that we don't want to allow this to prevent us going to Phase 2 in Gaza. We'll see where it goes. The big thing to me is, one, be on the lookout for these jihadists, these wolves in sheep's clothing, who are leading this so-called moderate technocratic committee. That's one major pause for concern right now. The other is make sure that pro-Islamist, pro-Muslim Brotherhood, pro-Hamas actors don't have a presence in Gaza. There's been a lot of talk about Turkey. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, is a fanatical Islamist. Along with Qatar, Turkey is one of the largest supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, that is the spiritual head of Hamas. Why would we give Turkey power in Gaza? Yes, they're part of NATO. I don't see why that matters. There's absolutely no reason for Turkey to be part of the situation in Gaza. Absolutely not. It makes no sense whatsoever. God willing, things stabilize there in Gaza. God willing, the notion of Palestinianism as this Oprah Winfrey style victimology ends. And much as young men these days and young women can lose weight without Ozempic, so too can the Arabs build for themselves a better life if they're so inclined. Thus far, at least in Gaza, they have shown very little interest in doing that. Before we go for the day, I want to briefly touch on this week's Torah portion. So as Jews, we read a portion of the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy, every week. And we're getting kind of to a really fun part. I mean, objectively, it's all holy, it's all amazing, of course. But this is a particularly fun part of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses. So we are now just in the second Parsha, the second Torah portion of the book of Exodus, what we refer to as Parsha Vayira. And this is where Moses and his brother Aaron go to Pharaoh, and they start saying, as you probably heard, "Let my people go." And they say it over and over and over again. And Pharaoh just repeatedly says no. And eventually, the staff, the physical staff, like the walking stick of Aaron, Moses' brother, then swallows the magic sticks of the Egyptian sorcerers. And this is supposed to convince Pharaoh to say, oh my God, the God of the Hebrew people is real, etc., etc. He still doesn't listen. And at that point, we get the first of the 7 of the 10 plagues, the famous 10 plagues. So the last 3 will be in next week's Torah portion, but the first 7, so the Nile River turns to blood, swarms of frogs overrun the entire land of Egypt, lice infest all men and beasts, hordes of wild animals invade the cities, a pestilence kills domestic animals, boils afflict the Egyptians, and then for the 7th plague, fire and ice continued to descend from the skies in the form of a devastating hail. Nonetheless, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and it took these 3 more plagues, including the ultimate 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn, in order to convince him to actually let the Israelites go. The question that I want to raise and briefly answer here in our final moments is this. Why? God is almighty. Jews and Christians alike believe that God is omnipotent, omniscient. He is almighty, all-powerful. So if the goal here, if God's goal in the beginning of Exodus is to free his chosen people out of bondage and enslavement and to bring them back to the chosen land, the land that he promised to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the question is, why couldn't he just do it in one fell swoop? Why this painful, painful process with all these 10 different plagues? What's the point? The answer, I believe, is as follows. God is not doing this for the Egyptians. He was doing it for the Israelites. It was all a bit of an extended act in order to increase their faith, their physical awareness that God controls everything, that he is almighty. It was an act to increase what in Hebrew we would describe as emunah, which is faith, and bitachon, which is knowledge in God's omnipotence and omniscience. You too can better yourself in life and get away from this victimology mentality if you believe with all of your emunah bitachon, your faith and knowledge, that God is real, he exists, he loves you, and he cares about you, and he wants to make your life better. I'm Josh Hammer. Have a great weekend, folks. We'll be right back on Monday.